The quote I picked here is that, as the famous quote by James Madison, popular democracy without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prelude to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both, highlights the importance of a well-functioning media system in democracies. And as Robert Dahl points out, if you have the ability to manipulate, if the content of the media is manipulated, which then affects public opinion, you effectively have the equivalent of a totalitarian system, which is quite disturbing, obviously. Anyway, definition of a frame, here's the definition we're using. And so basically the way that I understand it and Jovan understands it is the way that the media packages a given set of information into a narrative that's then presented. Framing effects can inhere in either the information itself that's presented or in the way that that information is presented, or both. The frames we use both information and quote-unquote pure framing effects. So the power framing is dependent on the ideas and the values that people already have. Obviously, if not all frames are equal, not all frames are equally convincing, and they are especially effective when they tap into what people already believe, what they already know. So why frames matter? Media framing can manipulate public opinion. It's kind of unnerving to see the broad array of framing studies that have been done that show that people's opinions get pushed rather noticeably in the direction of the frame, which is not what one would hope for a rational, critical public. And particularly dangerous here is the possibility that if the media, like in the United States, tend to simply report what people who currently enjoy political power believe, thereby leaving plenty of critical perspectives out of the public sphere, that can be very dangerous, as the US found out during the Iraq War, and I'm sure there's plenty of other examples of that, where you can point to. And this goes to that same issue. If you only divide along what elites believe, you're missing out on some very important things. Our study is on foreign policy attitudes. Framing might matter less in the area of foreign policy, as the Jacobson-Page study found. The number one influence of US foreign policy is what business leaders think. The number two influence is foreign policy elites. And number three, with barely a noticeable, if any, effect, is public opinion. So it could be that public opinion is not very important, hence media effects are not very important. But it could be also that the reason for that is that foreign policy elites and business leaders end up guiding public opinion in the direction that they already want. So I'll just leave that aside. So what we know about frames, I've gone into a little bit already. Framing effects can be muted by other frames. We know that. They can be muted by beliefs and conversations with other people that contradict the frame. And we also know that people deviate further from their values and beliefs when they're exposed to only one uncontested frame. So this study, I read this Mauro Porto paper and thought that he made a very convincing argument. This is a little part of it, but and then again, values are one of the most important things. So we wanted to look at people's foreign policy values and then see how frames would influence their values after they were exposed to the frame. And there's very little research thus far that examines the effects of multiple equal balanced frames on opinion. So dynamics of framing in competitive environments. Then to figure out how to operationalize values in the area of foreign policy, we looked at some previous work that had separated people's values in this area into 4 quadrants. So you can see from this, Holsey and Rosenau divided it by militant international and cooperative internationalism. Horwitz and Peffley did it by interventionism versus isolationism and militarism versus non-militarism. We based our operationalization on their work and updated it slightly. So we had 2 dimensions, left versus right, and interventionist versus isolationist. So we got 4 categories out of that: left-wing and right-wing isolationist, and left-wing and right-wing interventionist. LISO, LINT, RINT, and RISO. So just to give you an idea, a general broad idea. So the left and right dimension is basically on the left, foreign policy values are animated by a concern for human needs. It kind of taps into equality. On the right, the motivation is more national power, national security, more of an in-group focus. And then, of course, isolation and interventionism is talking only about military interventionism, the favor with which people hold the idea of intervening militarily, either for left-wing values, quote-unquote, or right-wing, quote-unquote, values. So just to break it down, LISO would, you'd see this kind of perspective in Democracy Now! And The Nation, for instance, perhaps from these two politicians. We did a media analysis for trying to find some articles on the Ukraine conflict and tried to find the commonalities. So the story that they tell is basically that the US and EU has been meddling in Ukraine, trying to get a friendly government in Ukraine and provoking Russia thereby. The motivation in the US is corporate interests. The motivation on Russia's part is defense. The concern is to avoid Ukrainian suffering and achieve peace, and the solution is to stop provoking and meddling. On the LINT side, the general story that we saw in the media accounts were the history is Russia's desire to stamp out a neighboring democracy. So the motivation was to protect Russia's own political system, to protect the Putin regime that is threatened by the emergence of democracy in a neighbor. The concern is to stop human rights abuses. That's what the articles seem to imply that we should be concerned about. And the solution is to threaten military forces if abuses continue. You can see that in those media sources and those politicians. The right-wing interventionist, the general story is that the history is Russia's desire to reconstitute its empire. Motivation is to uphold stability in the global order. That's what the US's motivation is. The concern should be to stop Russian aggression and expansionism, and the solution is to use military power to check Russia, whether by threats or by actual war. Weekly Standard, Washington Times will have this perspective. And then the right-wing isolationist is the classic American isolationism, now called paleoconservatism. In their accounts of the Ukraine conflict, the history is US expansion of NATO to Russia's doorstep in contradiction of the promises that were made to Russian leaders and during the breakup of the USSR that NATO wouldn't be expanded. And then the motivation on Russia's part is that Russia is understandably acting in self-defense. These articles didn't really get into the US motivation that much, at least in the American conservative. The concern that people should have is avoiding a broader war, and the solution is to stop NATO expansion and quit foreign entanglements, which is the broad theme. So the questions that we asked pre-treatment were questions on foreign policy values, each of which had a LISO, LINT, RINT, or RISO answer. Some other questions, you can see them here, and then 5 questions after reading the article. And then we had a control group who read the same introductory and concluding paragraph, and then a very bland anodyne middle paragraph that simply listed facts. Then we had treatments where the middle paragraphs gave the whole story like I explained before. And then one where all 4 frames were provided, and we tried to make it flow as best as we could so it didn't seem clunky, but it was basically explaining to people that some groups of experts think this way, other groups of experts think this way, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the hypotheses. Like, number 1 would be what tons and tons of other framing studies have found, and number 2 would be that multiple frames don't move people away from their values in any particular direction. Of note, before we get into the results, we found that LINT perspectives were the most common, particularly because even in the right-wing interventionist accounts, they would tack on a human rights, humanitarian motivation as well. So primary was, global stability, order, those sorts of concerns. But then also humanitarianism was involved. And there's a quote from Stephen Wald here that kind of might explain why that could be. So results, this is the control group. We expected no movement. There was no movement for 3 of the 4, but in 1 of the 4, we saw a significant gain after the control. So we also compared all subsequent conditions to the movement in the control group. So first result, left-wing isolationist, we actually saw it backfire. Contrary to what we expected, people ended up being less likely to choose LISO answers after reading the LISO article, the left-wing isolationist article, and instead shifted very strongly to the right. So among the possible explanations is the backfire effect. Chong and Druckmann have found that weak frames tend to move people in the opposite direction. There's some other evidence. Could be that Americans are more supportive just for whatever reason of interventionism. Although the evidence in that study there is, I think the conclusions were a little bit stretched. Anyway, don't have much time, but the left-wing interventionist treatment, however, had a huge effect in the direction we expected, also when compared to the control group. People really moved over there. And this is kind of a graphical representation of before and after. You can kind of see how people tended to be all over the place before, and they strongly shifted into the left-wing interventionist camp at the bottom left in the red after treatment. Right-wing interventionist, we also saw a big movement towards that direction after receiving that 1 frame. Again, it's significant after comparing it to the control group. Same with right-wing isolationist, people shift over there, also when compared to the control group. And then for all 4 frames together, we didn't find any significant movement. So that could be that people are just sticking to their guns. Could be that people are switching entirely from camp to camp. At this stage, we don't have the required granularity to answer that question. Although you can sort of see in the representation how people go from kind of spread out all over the place to a more central position after all 4 frames. And then just some preliminary regression results, controlling for a bunch of other factors. We found that the further one identifies as a conservative, the more likely one will shift towards the left-wing isolationist view, which we didn't expect but found interesting when you receive all 4 frames. So it could be that people hadn't really been exposed to that very much, and on first exposure they found it somewhat convincing. And then the further one identifies as a liberal or a leftist, the more likely you'll shift towards left-wing interventionism. Then, in conclusion, so it definitely seems this is some small evidence that it's important for media outlets to provide multiple perspectives on issues to avoid the normatively troubling, seemingly manipulative effect of single individual frames that framing research has found. And this supports Mauro Porto's news diversity standard. There's, you might be familiar with John Zaller's burglar alarm standard for news, or Doris Graeber's, I forget, something monitorial citizen, I think it is, which kind of strike me as a bit of apologetics for the American media system, which tends to be, well, just is absolutely far worse than tons of other media systems. Comparative media studies has demonstrated this conclusively in terms of the amount of information, the effects on knowledge and population. So this supports this idea of a news diversity standard. Yes, people aren't omniscient. They're not going to be able to remember everything, obviously. But at least if the media is providing a diversity of opinions and providing true pluralism in its coverage of foreign policy issues as well as every other issue, at least that gives people the chance to make a informed choice, not getting into free will or anything there, but it seems normatively less troubling. Thank you.